For that, welcome to yourneighbour.org. We are delighted that you're all here. Huge thank you to Olivia and her amazing team for doing this. A couple of very practical things to start with. We'd appreciate it if you stayed muted, except if you've got a question, that'd be really helpful to us. We are recording this. I did this seminar with my Elim Minister's hat on last week. Found it ridiculously helpful. And there was about 15 things that occurred to me as I was thinking about it afterwards. So the fact that we're recording this, it'll be on the website. Recommend rewatching it. Just before I hand over to Olivia, I just want to stress that the stuff we're covering this morning is in the realms of incredibly practical stuff. We're not talking about ministry. We're not talking about how to figure out whether you can sing or not sing or any of that stuff. We're talking about the practicalities of having a safe place of worship that we can come and gather in or work in. That's the bulk of what we're doing. And as we kind of go through the process, you'll see that in order to do that safely requires some thought and planning on our end as church leaders. So thank you again for joining us this morning, and I shall hand over to Olivia and her marvelous team. So
thank you very much, Marcus. It's great to be with you all. My name is Olivia Amartey, and I'm the Executive Director for the Elim Pentecostal Churches. I'm joined this morning as well by an incredible team who will be speaking to you in turn as we go through. This talk is predicated on a document that was sent out to all the Elim ministers called Preparing to Reopen Our Church Buildings and Facilities. And I'm not sure, Marcus, if that has been made available widely to the group of networks that you oversee, but it is available for you to use. Obviously, it's written from an Elim perspective. We're talking to our Elim ministers and church leaders. But as Marcus has already described, it does have some practical stuff, lots of practical stuff that I think any church leader would be able to use. If we just go through to the next slides, please. Thank you very much, Jimmy. So just a bit of housekeeping, as you all are anyway. We've muted your audio and you are on mute. If you do have any questions at all, can you put them in the chat? We will be pausing at various intervals for you to be able to ask us any questions you have at all. So each of us, as we do our presentations, will be pausing through that. But if you do have any other questions, and they have not been covered as we've paused and we've not given you an opportunity to, we're just going to pause so to ask you to put your questions in the chat, and at the end we will come back to that. Now this is for detailed questions for our Elim ministers in particular, but perhaps if there is anything that we haven't covered or that you're not sure of, please feel free to also use that email address. Obviously you've got your own people that you may want to be talking to. We are recording this seminar, so because of that and GDPR, you are free to turn off your video if you want to, and or change your name if you wish to protect your privacy. That's entirely up to you. So I would like to introduce my team. I'm not going to call out the names, I'm just going to let them float for a little while on this slide, but we are joined by a really dedicated members of our staff, but not necessarily all my team. Obviously I'm the executive director, but I work with an incredible group of people who do a lot of work and have been instrumental in both making sure that that document goes out and also equipping our 500 plus churches, both in the UK and overseas, on the mainland and off-site. We haven't got Andy with us, who's the communications manager. He has got some slides on there. I'll be speaking to those directly. Thank you. So the areas that we're going to be covering this morning are itemized on your bullet points there on your screen. We're going to be talking about a risk assessment. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to be talking about risk assessments, deep cleaning. Luckily I know it, Jimmy, so I know it all back of my head. How you manage your buildings. We're going to be talking about staff and their well-being, and developing your communications at the end. And of course, we'll pause for questions, as I've said, in between. We'll also have some questions at the end. Next slide, please, Jimmy. Okay, so we're going to kick off by talking about the risk assessment and the risk assessment template. Now, I'm completely aware that you may not have this in your various churches, but what Elim has done is to devise a risk assessment template that we have sent out, and the risk assessment template is specifically to deal with COVID-19 risk assessments. Okay, so if that template will be useful to you, please feel free, Marcus, to share it with those group of churches. You may already have your own from your own denominations, but please feel free to look at ours, and we'll be having a look at what that looks like in the next slide, but we'll start off here. So in carrying out your risk assessment, it's important that you do this before you reopen your churches. We don't know exactly when or precisely when churches will reopen. We know that in some of the Channel Islands that they are able to open from the end of this month, but for UK churches particularly, or for England, we are not clear exactly when that will happen yet. We are anticipating that it will be early July. For others, in other devolved governments, we are not exactly sure what will happen then, but we're pretty much sure that we'll follow perhaps soon afterwards. But we believe that carrying out a risk assessment is absolutely integral to you opening your churches. And this is the time, using these next few weeks, is important that you start to think about what that would look like. So we have said that it's an important thing for you to walk around your church and to look for areas where hazards could be, that you could cause the virus to spread. Now, when we talk about walking around your church, we're also talking about the car park as well. That's included as part of that. Anywhere where your congregants, where your visitors, your contractors, and anyone who hires your building will access are the areas that you will be looking to carry out your risk assessment. And we ask you to look to section 4 of the guide that will be emailed out to you. Please use it as you want to. That asks you really pertinent questions about what a risk assessment will include. And it also asks you to think ahead. What are you going to do once your building is open? How will you manage the flow of your congregants coming into and accessing your building? A risk assessment then asks you to identify all the hazards, all the risks, and to itemize these separately in the boxes in the risk assessment, because you are responsible for anyone that accesses your building, both your congregants, both anyone that hires your building, as well as contracted workers. Thank you. So we're advocating that your risk assessment is not rushed. I know that this is really difficult for a lot of people. For those of us who are used to carrying out risk assessments, then this is like falling off a log, isn't it? But for many people, this is a really undue, unwelcome, bureaucratic process. So we're asking you to take your time to do it. It's not a case of just filling in boxes and just leaving it at that. It's supposed to be a dynamic document. This means that it is not something that just simply sits on your shelf, but it is a document that you will visit regularly, because there will be government changes and there will be changes in your building. There will be changes to the things that you are doing. You need to revisit your document with your leadership team and or your team, however your governance is run. We are asking that you carry out your risk assessment not as a sole enterprise, but actually with a team of people, because others will be able to spot risks that you might necessarily overlook. So that's what we're asking you to do. And we have been running some Zoominars for the Elim group of churches. And of course, we're running this specifically for you today. So if you do need any help with that, please feel free to talk to your own organizations about how your risk assessments should be carried out in line with the governance of your organization. Thank you. So here we have the COVID-19 risk assessment, specifically for Elim Foursquare Gospel Alliance churches. So obviously this will not fit or may not fit into the models of risk assessment that you already have, or the templates that you may already have. This is peculiar to Elim, but we believe it may be useful for you in the absence of any other documentation. Our risk assessment is specifically, as I've said to you before, is specifically around COVID-19. You may already be used to having risk assessments, carrying out risk assessments for your building. For example, health and safety risk assessments, or when you put in a new piece of equipment. This is specifically for COVID-19. So we are looking at how we can minimize or eliminate the spread of coronavirus within your buildings and throughout your activities and throughout the people that will be accessing your building. And we have 7 columns that we are asking, or we've asked all our leaders to complete. The first column asks you what the hazards are. So this is where you look around, walk around your building and have a look at what are the hazards or the risks that you can identify readily, and then itemize them in this first column here. We've tried to populate this, or not tried, we have populated this for you so that you may have an idea about what sort of things you may have. The second column asks who may be harmed and how. We're asking you to list the personnel or the groups. And as you can see in this particular example, because we were talking about water or taps have not been in use since the lockdown occurred and the building was closed, that actually this could harm everybody who accesses the building, because you need water clearly. And there's a potential of Legionella. So the next column asks you to risk the assessment, whether what risk that a particular hazard, whether it's high, medium or low. For you, you will have to determine whether the risks are high, whether they're low or the medium. The whole point of a risk assessment is that you are mitigating your risks to the lowest possible level. So if you have a high, because obviously we're looking at this example here, it's a potential of Legionella, that's high. You know, people can be harmed by that. And if that's high, you should not have high assessments on your risk register for too long, because that tells you where your priority lies, and you should really be addressing all your highs, and you should be doing everything you can to control the risk, which is our next column. What are you already doing? You may already be doing something that controls the risk. So in this particular example, our caretaker runs a tap once a week. But if we're going to control Legionella and we want to prevent it altogether and eliminate it, then we need to have more up-to-date guidance on Legionella. And that's a control that you need, or we need to undertake to make sure that we are Legionella free. We've asked Jim to do that, and we've asked him to do it by the 12th of June, which are the other columns. It asks you who needs to carry out the action and when the action is needed to be undertaken by. That's why we ask you for your risk assessment to be as dynamic as possible. In other words, if you've put a date in here by which those risk assessments or those tasks should have been undertaken, it's important that you review them. Okay, it's really, really important that you review them. How and when, the frequency of how you review them is entirely up to you. I would suggest that, bearing in mind we are gearing up to open our churches, and certainly in the beginning of July, certainly by the middle of July, I would suggest that you revisit your risk assessments weekly, on a weekly basis. That's all I've got to say about that. Can I just have a look at the next slide, please, Jimmy, because I'm not quite sure what comes up next about that. And then I'll pause for some questions. Thank you. So in England, there is a COVID-19 secure certificate that you can place in prominent places in your church buildings, and you can download that from the hse.gov.uk website. And what this does is give assurance to your visitors, to your contractors, to your congregants, that you have undertaken a risk assessment, and that to your knowledge and to your team that you have done everything within your power and within your jurisdiction to ensure that you have made sure that your building's COVID-19 secure. That's really it. So I'm going to pause there for any questions that you may have. Please unmute yourself and ask your question, if you've got one. No questions? Is there anything in the chat there, Leanne, that we need to?
No.
Okay, that's fine. This is an incredibly great group then. No questions. So we move on to deep cleaning and personal protective equipment, PPE. Okay, now what we have said is that prior to opening your building, deep cleaning is a must. For many of us, we've not been accessing our buildings, certainly not in all the rooms or all the places that your buildings may have. It may be that you've accessed them for your work staff, if you've still got staff that are not furloughed and they've accessed your buildings, but certainly for our congregations, because our buildings have been closed to worship, then they have not probably been accessing the worship space. So a deep clean is important. And people have asked me, well, what is a deep clean? Well, that is described in the document itself. However, just to quickly go through it, deep clean involves the use of authorized cleaning chemicals. And on the document that I talked about, reopening your churches and facilities, there is an appendix. And in Appendix 2, you will find a list of all the authorized cleaning chemicals that we have used at the Elim International Centre. And that we recommend that you can also access. We've given you the suppliers there as well. We need you to be clear that, that there are other places and other suppliers available. We've only just given some guidelines to you that you may want to use for that. That's entirely up to you. But what we do say is that any chemicals that you do use will need to adhere to COSH guidelines. Many of you will be familiar with that. And that also you'll need to use chemicals that are advised to be effective against the virus itself. There is a standard, and I can never remember the number of the standard, but it's an ENS number. It's in that documentation. You'll be able to access that. Look at the back where it gives you not only a definition of deep cleaning, but also a protocol for deep cleaning your church and all your facilities. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. PPE. So this is entirely dependent upon your buildings, upon your facilities, upon your accesses to your facilities, about your car parking, your staff. Every building will have a different, will probably be assessing this differently. So if you are going to purchase PPE, you need to understand that it's entirely dependent on your facility, who's accessing your facility, who, if, example, you may have people that are hiring your facility, you may have staff that are particularly vulnerable. All of those things you will need to take into consideration. And once you've assessed that, you need to put it onto your risk assessment as well. So this affects the purchase of what equipment you will need. And that will again be highlighted in the COVID-19 risk assessment process. What we have advised our ministers to do in the Elim group of churches is that you as leaders of your churches need to think about what items you hold as stock. So if, for example, congregants are coming in, you open your worship services on a Sunday, most of your congregation may actually want to come in wearing masks. It's not mandatory for you to ask them to wear masks or for them to wear masks within your auditorium, unless your auditorium is of a specific size. So the government guidelines have specifically stated that, that you wear your masks, particularly if you're in a place where you cannot adhere to the 2-meter social distancing guidelines. If they're unable to do that and your building is quite small, then it may be that you think that wearing masks may be the best thing. For example, if you want to open up your church buildings for prayer and you're opening up a small room, and that small room means that you probably won't be able to adhere to that 2-meter social distancing guidelines, you may require people to wear masks, or face coverings, I should say, rather than masks. That's entirely up to you. Holding those stock items means that you may want to hold a spare stash of masks or face coverings and or visors. that's entirely up to you again. So please feel free to do that, so that if anyone's forgotten of their face covering, or feels that now that I've entered the building, I think I need to have one because they deem themselves at risk, then it would be great if you had a stock of items. What we do say in this final bullet point is to remember to factor in the lead time for the delivery of items. What we have found out at the Elim International Centre based at Malvern is that several weeks ago, we have ordered equipment. We've ordered sanitizing stations, we've ordered masks just to have a stock of items or face coverings. We've even ordered stocks of cleaning equipment. And some of them have been delayed simply because of the demand. So if you are thinking about opening your churches at the beginning of July, then you may need to factor in, or you will need to factor in, the lead time for the deliveries of those items. I'm going to pause there for any questions that you may want to ask. Leanne, is there anything in the chat?
Somebody's just asked, will a document be sent to everyone in the meeting or just to Elim churches?
Okay, so we are happy to share our document, and Marcus, you'll have the contact details for the people that are on this call. If they want them, I assume that they will come to you. Am I correct in that, Marcus?
We will do a follow-up email from today, and we'll attach the risk assessment and the document with that.
Thank you.
People have got it. So don't worry, we'll make sure you have all of the information.
Thank you. We're quite happy to share it. That was a team effort across our organisation, with my team particularly. We're more than happy for you to use that. If it can be of use to you, we know that some of it is Elim-centric, but it's generic enough that you'll be able to pick up some of those salient points. Thank you very much. So we move on to the next section.
Okay, my name's Sarah Bale, and Jonathan and I will be covering the next section, which is managing buildings and people. This is a really practical section, just about looking at your building and thinking about some issues that you might face. So I think the first thing to say is that it's safe to say that when we consider reopening our buildings, that social distancing measures will be with us for the foreseeable future. At the moment, it's 2 meters. Who knows, by the time we open churches, it may be 1 meter the way things are going. But on that basis, the first thing to consider is, how will you manage the number of people who may want to attend your church when services recommence in the building? It may be that you need to think about using a booking system such as Eventbrite or something like that to ensure that you don't have crowds of people turning up to the building and then you're having to turn people away. One thing that somebody mentioned in one of our previous sessions is always remember to save a few spaces for visitors, people who might just turn up, who've been watching you online, that kind of thing. Also, what the booking system would do is it would give you the basis of a register of attenders in line with the contact tracing guidelines. So it's something just a second advantage really of that system. You could consider staggering people's arrival and departure times, although obviously we know that you can't always guarantee that people will stick to the time slot that you give them. If your church has a car park, social distancing measures need to start there. Maybe consider taping off a number of spaces to allow social distancing as people exit and enter their vehicles. External to the building, you might want to think about placing 2 meter markers on the ground to allow for a socially distanced queue if a number of people do arrive at the same time. On entering and leaving the building, people should be asked to wash their hands thoroughly for at least 20 seconds using soap and water, or of course hand sanitizer if hand washing facilities aren't available. Also, it would be useful to have hand sanitizer available at strategic points around the building where people are moving around, touching surfaces like door handles and so on. Where possible, prop doors open so less people have to touch the surfaces. Obviously, that doesn't include propping fire doors open. Where possible, have doors and windows open just to allow and improve the ventilation. Think about how people will enter the church building whilst maintaining a social distance. We know that people are going to be looking forward to seeing each other. So you might need stewards available to keep the flow moving so that people don't congregate in the entrance hall, their entrance area. Obviously, in the new era of social distancing, handshakes and hugs are off the agenda. I'm sure most people will know that, but again, it's just worth making sure your steward and your team follow and encourage good practice, because we know, as we said, people are going to be really keen to see each other. If possible, have multiple entry points, or at least one door for entrance and one door for exit. Where possible, have a one-way system around the building. Also, think about how you're going to manage the pinch points in your building, like the stairs, the hallways, those sort of spaces. Ensure that as people go around the building, there's sufficient signage up for them, and maybe markings on the floor, so that they understand the new rules, the flow of traffic, and then of course have plenty of stewards around the building just to help people as they get used to the new systems. If you've got a larger church building, think about the spaces that you want to open up at this stage. It may be that actually there's quite a few small rooms that you can just close down, and that just minimises the risks of spreading the virus, but also it ensures a good cleaning regime is possible. In your actual meeting space, you might need to move chairs around further apart, obviously stacking or storing those other chairs safely. Or tape off some seats to enforce distancing. You need to think about how that will work for groups that come from the same household, where there might be young children and they need to sit together. And of course, remember that the 2 meters distance is forwards, backwards and sideways. So it's quite a big space around one chair. Think about your offering. Will you take an offering? If so, can you encourage online giving as much as possible? If it's a physical offering, I would recommend that you don't pass the plate around from hand to hand, but that you perhaps have it at an exit point in the building. And again, just encourage people to be ready to give on the way out, rather than to get to the plate and then having to fumble around in a bag or a purse or a wallet, trying to find their offering. Anyone counting that offering should wear gloves. Now might not be the appropriate time to think about starting your children's work, but it might be a conversation that you want to start. You know, what will happen when you want to do that? How will you protect both children and adults from transmitting the virus? Is the room that you previously used now big enough to allow for social distancing? Are the children of an age where they perhaps won't need to be in close contact with leaders, and so on? Just one additional bit. The latest government advice published on the 12th of June actually states any facilities for children, such as play corners, books, toys, should be removed, and any outdoor play equipment, climbing frames, slides, etc. should remain closed. Particular attention should be paid to cleaning frequently touched surfaces, which are at child height. So that's just fairly recent advice. Another thing just to think about is, will you consider offering refreshments or not at this point? If you do offer refreshments, just be aware of the potential risks of transferring the virus on surfaces such as cups, tables, etc. And consider how you'll minimise such risks and what appropriate cleaning you'll do if it's in between multiple services. And then finally, in this section, just before I hand over to Jonathan, think about how people will safely exit the meeting space and the building. It might be helpful, for example, to have stewards dismiss attenders in a controlled and orderly manner so that they can maintain social distancing, rather than just saying, you know, as we would do normally, goodbye everybody, and everybody heads for the doors. So that's just something to think about. I don't know if there's any questions on this section before I just hand over to Jonathan.
Yeah, no questions, Sarah.
Okay, well, I'll hand over to Jonathan to take us through the rest of this section.
Great, thanks, Sarah. I hope everyone can hear me. It's all good to be with you today. So following on from the points already made, let's also consider what it might look like as and when you start opening up for additional activities. There are several key considerations to start thinking through here. So first off, You'll need to think about whether the rooms you normally use are sufficient size to accommodate the group while maintaining social distance. Will you need to move to a different room, limit numbers, or split to more than one group even? Flag up whether other activities will be going on at the same time, and if so, how will you ensure the two activities maintain social distancing? Could they be rearranged? Might they be able to be operated in different rooms, etc.? Don't forget to consider how you'll communicate all this clearly to the various groups you may have using your building. It'll be talked about later, but communication is key and to ensure it gets filtered out to all the groups that are using the different spaces. Also, do you need to safely recruit additional group leaders to help manage the activities? Not forgetting, in your particular context, to consider your safeguarding policy as well, to make sure it's in line with whatever that might look like for you. Very importantly, begin thinking over when you should restart groups that include vulnerable or shielded people due to age and obviously health conditions as well. That's of key importance, whether or not it's appropriate to include them in any groups you might restart. If you are increasing the number of groups, do you need additional support with cleaning, caretaking, and furniture arrangement to ensure these activities operate as safely and as smoothly as possible? Okay, so moving on to congregations hosted in the church building. So many different churches, not just our own in Elim, but of different denominations and networks, they'll have other congregations using their church building. And if that's the case for you, you'll need to agree with the hosted congregations their responsibilities to maintain good practice on distancing, cleaning routines, etc. It's not good enough that you have that in place, as good as that is, but we also need to ensure that our other congregations are also aware of what's expected of them. Some things to consider include agreeing with them the specific spaces that they may use during this time to minimize the risk of spreading the virus. Consider whether times of their services need to be altered, for example, starting earlier or later, or creating a transition time in between services to allow for appropriate cleaning. It's important to request that they complete a risk assessment, as Olivia's already informed us of, for their activities, and that they share these with you as the host church for your records. Again, it's great that you do your own risk assessment, but we also need to ensure that our users have their own in place as well. Now, let's move on to external groups using the building. Specifically, first of all, ad hoc lettings you might have in your properties. In terms of ad hoc lettings, consider how important these are to the life of the church at this time. It might be that the income from these groups is essential, or that the service they offer is a part of and in line with your vision and mission for the church, and therefore you'll want to allow them back in as soon as possible, which would be great. It might be also helpful just to take this opportunity just to review your lettings as well and just see if everything is shipshape, if everything's in place, or if there's anything you need to address to make sure everything's running smoothly. As previously mentioned, think about how you will ensure the organisation will maintain safe practice. Also consider what additional cleaning is appropriate as a consequence of such ad hoc external lettings you might have. Now, in regards to leases, if you have a lease with an external organisation, you will be required to allow your tenant to exercise their rights under the lease. For example, whatever your situation might be, but let's say if you have a nursery operating in your building, under the lease that they have with yourselves, they will need to be allowed to continue to do so, but obviously in keeping with the government's guidance. You can require that they carry out additional health and safety requirements, such as thoroughly cleaning the space after or before the use. You should also request a risk assessment from such groups as well. Ultimately, think through how you will manage external groups using the building and primarily how you will keep your staff, your congregations, and other users of the space safe all the time. And then lastly, let's look at using hired buildings for your church meetings. So this isn't your own building, but this is you as a church using an external building. If you're using a hired building for your services, you will need to have a conversation with the owners regarding what safety measures they are putting in place and their expectations of you as the tenants or occupiers of their space. Think about what you'd expect from users of your own building, as we've already discussed, and then put yourself in their shoes. So whatever you would want from users of your building, put that same expectation on yourself, and let's just make sure we do things with excellence. Ask to see the building owner's risk assessment, but also complete a risk assessment for your own activities in the building. It's important to evidence appropriate steps that have been taken to ensure safety measures are identified as and adhered to. You may also need to think through what you will do if you are on a daily hire basis, so some kind of hiring agreement, as some of these venues may not want you to return in the immediate future, but perhaps at a later date. For example, if you're meeting in a school, it is highly likely schools will not want the additional burden of managing external groups in their buildings at the moment. So it's good to get ahead of the game and just see what your situation is in any of the buildings you might be using externally. So I'm just going to bring Sarah back in, and if there are any other questions that people have, then we can see if we can answer them. Thanks, Leanne.
Yeah, I think Olivia's got 2 questions. My chat just wiped out clear.
Yes.
So,
Okay, so I think there was a question from Earl, or Errol Dykes to everyone. He says, what is the risk profile for upholstered seats? So I can, sorry, Sarah, do you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead, yeah, if you know.
Okay, so obviously the virus can live on surfaces for up to 72 hours. There is in the appendices of the document that we talked about some information about deep cleaning and some information about the suppliers for whom you may want to purchase the chemicals from. One of those chemicals is Biotrol, I think it's called, and is in the spray function. So you can spray it onto upholstery or any fabrics in your buildings, i.e. curtains or blinds, things that are sometimes a little bit more difficult to clean, and that will be, and has been found to be effective against the virus. So I hope that answers your question. Please look at that supply section. And I think there was another question as well from Marcus, where it said, training of the ushers welcome team seems key. Any advice on how to do that well? Sarah?
Well, I suppose it is literally that, just as the case of taking time to do it.
Yes.
And I think really it is pretty much about, I would make sure that everything's set up in your building ahead of time, take them through the processes, take them through the one-way systems, and just really spend a considerable amount of time doing that, I think. And I think it's as simple as that, unless you've got anything to add, Olivia?
No, I think I was going to say exactly the same thing. It's crucial. In fact, it's critical to the operating of your building that you train your stewards. I would also suggest something as simple as making sure that they stand out. So you may wish to purchase polo shirts in whatever color you may want. That makes it entirely, if you like, clear that these are stewards and these are people that can be approached, socially distanced, of course, for any advice that your congregants and or users of your building may need at that time. I think it's as simple as that way of training.
There's just another question. What's the evidence on use of air conditioning?
Right, so there is no evidence apart from, we looked at this as part of our risk assessment Zoominars, it has been advised that you use air conditioning, but it's advised obviously before you start to use that it is, because our buildings have been empty for such a long time, that you do have them checked. But of course, if you don't have air conditioning, then it's about opening the doors, making sure that you open your doors and windows so that fresh air can circulate through. I would suggest, and I have been suggesting whenever we've had this question come up, that for those of you who have air conditioning units in your buildings, that you contact your air conditioning contractor and ask for their advice on this and the use of it during this easing of the lockdown period. I'm afraid I don't know any more than that. Thank you.
No more questions?
No more questions. Thank you.
Okay, so it's over to me then. So my name is Jimmy and I'm the HR manager here at Elim, and I'll be covering a section on staff and well-being. So it's very much about what to do when staff are returning, say from furlough, for example, or even working from home. So the first step is to make sure you've got a safe working environment. So when we talked about a risk assessment and a deep clean, that is essential as well for your staff before they come back. There's only one reason why staff could refuse to come back into the workplace, and that's if their health and safety is not cared for. So if you follow the government guidance, and if you outside England just follow one of the local guidances from there, as long as you follow that guidance and you do your risk assessment and you can show that you've done that, then people should come back when you need them to. The only way people could argue they should stay at home is if they're shielding, of course, or they're caring for someone who is shielding. So just be aware of that. But when people do come back, then some of the areas you need to focus on is, for example, increased cleaning of work surfaces. So before lockdown, we asked everyone here to wipe down their keyboards and their phone regularly, the door handles. But we also had a housekeeping team on hand who was doing some extra cleaning through the corridors and other common areas that people used a lot. The other things you can do is staggering shifts. So to ensure that you don't have too many people in the same room at any one time, ask people to maybe work one day at home, one day in the office, and then kind of swap that with the other team members so that only half your team is in the office at any time. And that would also help you, of course, making sure that a 2-meter distance is actually adhered to. If you're on wheels, just be aware that the 2-meter distance, you are responsible to make sure that happens, and it's the only administration that actually has made it a legal requirement. So failure to comply means you can actually get fined for that. So just be aware of that you're on wheels. The other thing to do is to be vigilant with staff who show symptoms. So prior to COVID, often presenteeism, people coming into the workplace when they're slightly ill or snotty, was kind of accepted. Shouldn't be accepted at all, especially now. You need to be extra vigilant that you make sure that anyone who has specifically the COVID symptoms, that you send them home and they don't come in. If they have entered the workplace, of course, you need to make sure that you know who they've been in contact with. And although the track and trace system will track you down if they're tested positively, what I do recommend and what we recommend in our churches is to ask the staff member who have the symptoms to get tested. You can't make them take a test, but it would certainly help you and your team know whether you can stay open or not. And the other recommendation is then, while you wait for that test, and now it can be as quick as 24 hours, keep the people at home while you're waiting for the test result to come back. And if it turns out it is a positive test result, obviously then you'll be all asked to isolate yourselves for 2 weeks. So again, local lockdowns may happen, and we're telling our churches to be prepared for that when that happens. Now, people can still work from home in that moment, so it's not that they also have to be home for 2 weeks on sick leave. They can still work from home if they're able to. Obviously, if they are going through dealing with COVID than that sick leave for obvious reasons. When you have people working from home, just make sure you still look after those people. It's very easy to feel isolated when you work from home and disconnected. So regular contact is what we recommend our line managers to ensure you've got regular contact with your staff. And this is through the form of like one-to-ones, appraisals, but also through social calls. So just if you can do a coffee time with your team, or just a simple quick call to say, hey, how are you doing today? It is very effective. It sounds simple, it sounds maybe a bit silly, but it is very effective to ensure that there is a connection going. Do also stay in touch with those who remain on furlough. So of course, furlough is now extended until the end of October, and there'll be some changes coming in from the 1st of July, but people can stay on furlough full time all the way up to the end of October. And again, for that group, it's even more important that you keep contact with them. So although you cannot engage them in any work while on furlough, from the 1st of July, you can engage them on a part-time basis. But while during the furlough period, they cannot work, but you can have social contact with them, and you can update on what the church is doing while they're furloughed. Again, just to make sure that A, they're connected to the organization still, but two, as well, is to actually, it helps with their mental well-being. Loneliness is going through the roof at the moment throughout the UK with people who have been locked down, and so having contact with their employer is actually quite helpful, and it also ensures that they're not forgotten about. And then that leads me to my final point, which is to focus on mental health. So whenever people are working from home in any normal circumstances, we find that stress is often a factor that could occur when people work from home. There's studies done on this, but while COVID is going on, and with the news of redundancies happening all over the country, people are extra anxious as they go through this period. Whether they're working or on furlough, they're anxious. So focusing on mental health is quite key. And that can be done, again, through regular contact with them, having conversations with them, asking them how they're doing. Don't be afraid to ask if they are doing okay, and if you can help with anything. Of course, not all of us are psychologists, so we cannot help them with the extreme issues, but we can kind of guide them to certain guidance. So mind.org.uk does fantastic guidance. The Church of England has released some very good guidance early on. And there's also, of course, the NHS guidance. And those who are really struggling, recommendation is to get them to call 111 so they can see if they can get any help for that. So that's on mental health. And I just want to focus on furloughing staff, recalling the furlough staff. So there's a link in there that if you click on it, you'll probably be locked out if you're not an Elim person, because it takes you to a login page. But essentially, the steps you need to take are make sure that workplace safe return. We cannot emphasize that enough. Write to the employees using the template. So we can provide you with a template letter that we can distribute while we distribute a guidance document as well. And it's just to ensure that you notify your employee formally that they are to return to work, but also for HMRC purposes, because they can order this for the next 5 years. It's good to have a document in place that said when they went on furlough, and a document to say when they returned to furlough. And so when HMRC comes in, you can demonstrate quite easily what the furlough period was, and then link that to your claim. Give as much notice as possible. So on the furlough, depending on how you had your agreement in the first place, but on the furlough, notice periods can be as little as a week. It can be as little as a day, but we're going for a week just to give people some time to adjust and come back to work again. But give as much notice as possible. So if you know someone is to return middle of July, let them know now so they can make arrangements for that. So if they have children, for example, or they currently in an isolation bubble with someone on the other side of the country, they know to be back for that particular day. So the more notice you can give, the better. Those who have children and are not returning to school, obviously try to be flexible where possible. So, you know, can they arrange childcare? Will that put them massively out of pocket? These are the kind of things you can discuss with your employees. Obviously, if they chose not to put the kids back to school, that's a different matter. But as the government recently announced that most years are not returning now until September, a lot of parents will face some difficulties in coming into the office again on a regular basis. So things you can do for those people is, for example, ask them to work from home. Now, you need to have systems set up for that, so you make sure your IT systems are set up for that. Make sure you can do it securely so you don't breach any data protection. And obviously, again, making sure that you keep regular contact with them, because it's quite easy to forget if they're not in the office. And the same applies to people who are shielding or caring for people who are shielding. And with those people, you actually should be extra flexible, because there is potential for discrimination claims if they're shielding for the fact that they've got a vulnerable, they're more at risk of catching COVID and therefore have to stay at home. And that could be because of diabetes, for example, which is considered to be a disability. So just be extra careful with people who are shielding for medical reasons. And as I said, last thing was that if you do recall furlough people, they can work from home. And yeah, that is my section. So any questions?
No. I think Olivia's just asked the last one, so no more.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. So we're nearly there. I'm just going to do this final section on clear and regular communication. I think it goes without saying that communication is key to all of this. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what we're looking at is concentric circles around communication. Obviously, just as the government has been communicating with us, they've changed their slogan from first three during the period of lockdown to now another 3 now that we're exiting. It's important that we have the same clear, consistent messages that go out to a range of people. And what this diagram basically shows is whom those communications need to go out to and whom you need to consider when you are communicating, both the opening of your buildings, how the buildings will function, how church services will look like, how they will be able to access you as a senior leader or your team and or others. So there's any number of things dependent on your facilities that you need to coordinate and to communicate. So of course it starts off with your inner circle. Your inner circle will be your core team. That is dependent of course on your own governance. So it may be yourself and some elders, or yourselves and your presbytery, or yourselves and the people that you work with or that you oversee. So making sure and agreeing the communication is important. And it's always important to look at whom you need to communicate with and how you need to communicate with them. So obviously when you're communicating with your inner circle, because they are with you all the time, then it's fairly easy to communicate with them by phone, by WhatsApp, by email. Both your inner circle and your core team. With your congregation, it may be a little bit more. You may have to then consider how you communicate with your congregation. You may already have a website or a Facebook page, or you may do the old snail mail where you send out an email preparing your congregation for what the new world or new normal will look like. That's really, really important, so that everyone knows what to expect. So for example, we're now currently adhering to the 2-meter social distancing rules. Most of your congregation will already know that. They will have had experience of that when they go to the shops or wherever they go in the community. However, they will never have adhered to that in a church setting or in a worship setting. So you will need to be clear about what that looks like. So it may be that you prepare them for the fact that there will be sanitizing stations, There will be reminders of the social distancing rules by signage, whatever it may be. It may be that you only allow certain the toilets to be opened for a certain number of times, or that they need to be adhering to hand washing, or there are no tea and coffees will be served after the service, or you will not have people lingering around in the service. Whatever it may be, whatever those rules come out as part of your risk assessment, you will need to communicate to your congregation. And of course, you can't forget your community, because many of us have buildings that the community access or use. They also need to know what services will look like. We don't know how they will be accessing our buildings, and we've talked earlier, Sarah talked earlier about making sure that there are some spaces left in our church services for community members who may want to come in and engage with us, but they need to know what that looks like in a worship setting as well. So whether it's a community newsletter on your charity shop walls or your buildings, or leaflets that can be emailed out if you've got an email list, or your website, whatever, please make sure that you communicate with both your inner circle all the way through to the community. Next slide, please. I'm not going to really major very much on this slide, but this just reiterates the key things that you need to think about. Of course, you're communicating why, what, how, and when. But the most important thing to remember is the why. Why are you communicating that? And what are you communicating? And how are you doing that? So really, without talking too much more about that, it's important that your messages are clear, and it's important that your community, right through to your inner circle, understand why you are communicating and what you are trying to say, and say it as clearly as possible. Thank you. And the next slide, please. Clearly, I've probably reiterated this again. You need to decipher how your messages are going to be received, and that also determines how you communicate your messages. When you're communicating to your to inside, i.e. people that are internal to you, that includes your core team, your inner circle, as well as your congregants, that's, you will already have had some experience about doing that, and you will tailor your message accordingly. However, when you're communicating externally to your building for people who may not be core members of your churches, or be engaged with you as often as your congregants will have, then you will probably need to think about how you communicate your message to those in your community, and or access your buildings externally as well. I think that's all I'm going to leave it there as, just to say that that it's really important that whatever you do, you communicate. So we have finished our presentation. Thank you for those of you still hung in there with us. We're going to give you the opportunity to be able to ask any questions that you may want of us.
Olivia, I've got one question here.
Yeah.
Any comments about singing and playing wind instruments?
Okay, we've had this question consistently in every webinar that we've done. Now, when we have looked across Europe, we have seen, because they've opened their worship spaces ahead of us, that singing has not been part of the gathered service. We've noted that. And we have not, of course, been advised by our UK government or any of the devolved authorities about singing. As far as we know, singing will not be part, or may not very well be part, of the reopening of any worship services. And that's because the singing actually propels the virus, or could propel the virus if you are infected, much further than just talking. Wind instruments I absolutely know nothing about, so I can't say anything about that at all. But I'm anticipating that singing may not be part of our worship services and our worship gatherings going forward. But of course, you will need to adhere to the government guidelines on that. I'm afraid that I haven't got any more or any further useful answers to that at this point. Have we got any further questions, Leanne?
No, no further questions.
Thank you. If you do have any questions, we're just going to pause for just a few moments before we get our final slide on. And I'll hand back over to Marcus. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to unmute. You can ask any one of our team and we'll be able to answer any questions as well as we can do. Are there any? We just give you the opportunity to do that. No? Then I hand back over to you, Marcus. Thank you very much for allowing us to share with you today.
I think just on behalf of everybody else, thank you so much. That's incredibly thorough list of things to think about. I remember fairly early in my church leadership discovering the lesson that the really important stuff was often not the exciting stuff. However, it is important that we get this right. So huge thank you again to Olivia, Jonathan, Sarah, Leanne, Paul and Jimmy. We're grateful that you've made the time. There will be an email out to everybody who was registered for this at some point today or tomorrow, and I'll include the links to the documents we mentioned. Just also want to mention, you probably want to have a look at the yourneighbour.org website. There's lots of really useful material on there and all kinds of things related to how churches respond to COVID-19. There's an interview with a health and safety guy I did, a good friend of mine, which it kind of gives a slightly different spin on some of these things that might be useful on this topic for you as well. Just again, thank you very much to Olivia and the team and for everybody for making the time for this morning. So I hope it's helped you as much as it's helped me and the church I'm part of at the moment. So thank you very much, guys. It's great to have you with us.